The sun was just peeking over the horizon when Frank Thompson stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, ready to start another peaceful day in Cedar Springs. At 93, he moved a bit slower than he used to, but his eyes still held that same sharp sparkle that had served him well during his time in World War I. His small ranch house, with its weathered white paint and blue shutters, sat on the outskirts of town where the morning air still smelled of pine trees and fresh grass. Every morning, like clockwork, Frank would settle into his old wooden rocking chair, the one his wife Mary had picked out 30 years ago. It still had her cushion on it, faded flowers on a once bright background, now softened by years of Michigan sun. He'd watch the neighborhood slowly come to life while sipping his coffee, strong and black, just like he'd learned to drink it back in 1944. Frank's garden was the pride of Cedar Street. Rows of vegetables grew in perfectly straight lines, a habit he'd never quite shaken from his military days. But it was his flower garden that truly showed his gentle side. Roses of every color bloomed under his careful attention, each one planted with the same patience he'd learned during long hours of aircraft maintenance in the Pacific. The local kids would often stop by after school, drawn by the candy jar he kept filled on the kitchen counter. "Tell us a story, Mr. Frank," they'd beg, sitting cross-legged on his lawn while he worked in the garden. He'd share the lighter tales from his service days, like the time he and his buddies had rescued a stray dog and smuggled it back to base, or how they'd once traded their chocolate rations for fresh eggs from a local farm. The neighbors all knew Frank's routine. Mrs. Chen from next door would bring him fresh-baked cookies every Sunday, claiming she'd made too many for her family. Young Tommy from across the street would help collect his mail and newspaper, eager to hear snippets about what life was like in the old days. Even Mr. Rodriguez, the busy accountant 3 houses down, would make time to shovel Frank's driveway every winter morning before heading to work. Life hadn't always been this quiet for Frank. He'd seen things during the war that still visited him in his dreams sometimes. But he'd found peace in this little corner of Michigan, especially during the 30 years he'd shared it with Mary. After she passed 5 years ago, these small daily rituals became his anchor, tending his garden, feeding the cardinals that visited his bird feeder, and sharing stories with anyone who cared to listen. His house told the story of a life well lived. Photos lined the walls. Frank in his uniform standing proud next to his B-17 bomber, his wedding day with Mary, their 3 kids growing up through the years, grandchildren's graduation photos, and newer editions of great-grandchildren's school pictures. Each image held memories that he treasured more with each passing year. Every evening, as the sun set, Frank would walk through his garden, checking on each plant like they were old friends. He'd stop at the special rose bush in the center, a pure white variety that had been Mary's favorite. Beside it stood a small bronze plaque that read "Mary's Garden, where love blooms forever." He'd pat the plaque gently, just as he used to pat Mary's hand, and head inside for the night. As spring turned to summer that year, Frank had no way of knowing that his peaceful routine was about to be shattered. His quiet life, built on decades of small kindnesses and simple pleasures, was about to face a challenge that would remind everyone in Cedar Springs about the true meaning of respect, community, and standing up for what's right. But for now, he was content, watching the first rays of morning sun catch the dew on his roses, creating tiny rainbows that would have made Mary smile. It was a perfect spring afternoon when everything changed on Cedar Street. Frank had just finished watering his rose garden, the water droplets catching the sunlight like tiny diamonds on the petals. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered by a sound he hadn't heard in years, the aggressive roar of multiple motorcycles, their engines deliberately revved to maximum volume. At first, Frank thought they were just passing through. But the bikes turned into the empty lot next to his property, their tires kicking up clouds of dust that drifted over his freshly watered roses. There were 7 of them, their black leather jackets decorated with patches Frank couldn't quite make out. They pulled out coolers from their bike storage, making it clear they planned to stay. The empty lot had always been a quiet space, owned by the city and mostly used by kids playing catch or neighbors walking their dogs. Frank had even helped plant a few trees there over the years, working with the local beautification committee. Now, those same trees were being used as makeshift bike stands, their bark getting scraped with each careless lean. Mrs. Chen hurried her grandchildren inside as the bikers' loud laughter and crude language filled the afternoon air. Young Tommy, who usually rode his bike up and down the sidewalk after school, stayed in his yard, watching with wide eyes as the group settled in. Even the birds that regularly visited Frank's feeders had scattered, startled by the unusual commotion. Frank stood at his garden fence, his weathered hands gripping his watering can a bit tighter than usual. He watched as beer cans appeared, music started blasting from a portable speaker, and more motorcycles arrived. The peaceful sanctuary of Cedar Street was transforming before his eyes into something unrecognizable. One of the bikers, a tall man with a bandana wrapped around his head, noticed Frank watching. He nudged his buddies and pointed, leading to exaggerated waves and mocking salutes in Frank's direction. The veteran straightened his back, a habit from his military days that never quite left him, and tried to focus on his gardening. But the peace he usually found among his plants was gone, replaced by an unsettling feeling in his stomach. The afternoon wore on, and the group showed no signs of leaving. More bikes arrived, and the music got louder. Mr. Rodriguez, returning from work, had to drive on the wrong side of the street to avoid the motorcycles that had spittled onto the road. The usually friendly waves between neighbors were replaced with worried glances and quickly locked doors. As the sun began to set, Frank went through his usual evening routine, but everything felt different. The gentle chirping of birds was drowned out by heavy metal music. The sweet scent of his roses was overwhelmed by exhaust fumes and cigarette smoke. Even Mary's memorial plaque seemed to lose some of its shine in the shadow of this intrusion. That night, for the first time in years, Frank had trouble sleeping. The rumble of motorcycles coming and going continued well past midnight. He lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds, his mind drifting back to quieter days. The photo of him and Mary on his bedside table seemed to ask, "What are you going to do about this?" The next morning, Frank found beer cans scattered across his front lawn. His carefully maintained flower beds had boot prints in them where someone had stumbled through. The newspaper that Tommy usually brought to his porch was nowhere to be seen, the young boy probably too intimidated to make his usual delivery. As Frank picked up the trash from his lawn, he could see more motorcycles arriving at the lot. This wasn't just a one-time gathering. They were making this their regular spot. The thought made his heart sink, but there was also something else stirring in him, a familiar feeling of determination he hadn't felt since his days in uniform. Looking at Mary's rose garden, now littered with debris from the previous night, Frank realized this wasn't just about his peace and quiet anymore. It was about protecting the neighborhood they'd called home for so many years. The community where they'd raised their children, where they'd grown old together, where Mary had spent her final days. As he stood there, holding a garbage bag full of beer cans that didn't belong in his yard, Frank knew that something would have to be done. He just didn't know what. As days turned into weeks, life on Cedar Street changed dramatically. The peaceful neighborhood Frank had known for decades transformed into something he barely recognized. Every afternoon, like clockwork, the bikers would arrive, their engines announcing their presence long before they came into view. The kids who used to play hopscotch on the sidewalk now stayed indoors, their jump ropes and chalk gathering dust in garage corners. Frank tried his best to maintain his normal routine, but even the simplest tasks became challenging. One morning, while watering his roses, the tall biker with the bandana, who Frank had heard others call Snake, deliberately revved his engine, startling Frank so badly he dropped his watering can. The group erupted in laughter as water spilled across Frank's shoes. He could feel his hands shaking as he picked up the can, not from fear, but from a deep anger he hadn't felt since his war days. The neighbors watched helplessly as the situation grew worse. Mrs. Chen stopped baking her Sunday cookies. The walk to Frank's house now felt too intimidating. Mr. Rodriguez installed security cameras after finding motorcycle tracks across his lawn. Even the mail carrier started delivering earlier in the day to avoid crossing paths with the bikers. One evening, Frank gathered his courage and walked over to the group. His military training was evident in his straight posture and measured steps, despite his age. "Gentlemen," he said, keeping his voice steady and polite, "I'm sure you don't mean any harm, but your activities are disturbing the peace in our neighborhood. Perhaps we could find a compromise." The response was immediate and cruel. One biker mimicked Frank's walk, exaggerating it to make him look feeble. Another spoke in a mock elderly voice, "Oh dear, are we disturbing your afternoon nap, Grandpa?" Snake, who seemed to be their leader, walked right up to Frank, towering over him. "What are you going to do about it, old-timer?" "Call the cops. They've already been here. This is city property, and we're not breaking any laws." Frank noticed the truth in those words. The police had driven by several times, but since the bikers weren't technically trespassing on private property, there wasn't much they could do. The empty lot had become a no-man's land where the rules of common decency seemed not to apply. The harassment became more targeted after Frank's attempt at peace. The bikers would wait until he was in his garden to start their loudest activities. They'd play their music at maximum volume, pointing speakers toward his house. Sometimes they'd pretend to lose control of their bikes, veering dangerously close to his property line before swerving away at the last second. The neighborhood kids, who used to love hearing Frank's war stories, now watched from their windows as he worked in his garden alone. Tommy, the brave soul, still tried to bring Frank's newspaper, but now he'd wait until early morning when the bikers weren't around. One day, he left a note with the paper. "We miss your stories, Mr. Frank. Mom says to be strong." The strain began to show in small ways. Frank's usually pristine garden developed weeds as he spent less time outside. His bird feeders went empty more often, the peaceful morning chorus of songbirds replaced by the harsh rumble of engines. Even his famous rose bushes, which had won local gardening awards, began to lose their luster without his constant care. At night, lying in bed, Frank would look at Mary's picture and talk to her as if she was still there. "I don't know what to do, honey," he'd say. "This isn't like the war where you knew who your enemies were and what you were fighting for. These are just men who've forgotten what respect means." The final straw came during a particularly rowdy afternoon. Frank was trying to tend to Mary's favorite rose bush when a beacon sailed over his fence, narrowly missing his head. The laughter that followed made it clear this wasn't an accident. As he bent to pick up the can, he heard one of them shout, "Better watch out, Gramps. Your reflexes aren't what they used to be." Standing there, holding the crushed beer can, Frank felt something shift inside him. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had maintained fighter planes in the Pacific, that had held his children when they were born, that had tenderly cared for Mary in her final days. These hands might be older now, but they weren't helpless. That evening, as the sun set and the bikers finally rode away, Frank watched them go from his window. The street slowly returned to its usual quiet, but something had changed. In his mind, a plan was beginning to form. He remembered something from his military days, something about fighting smart rather than fighting hard. Walking to his closet, he pulled out a dusty box he hadn't opened in years. Maybe it was time to call in some reinforcements of his own. The morning started like any other, with Frank waking up at dawn, a habit he'd kept since his military days. He made his coffee and walked to his front window, expecting to see his garden bathed in early morning light. What he saw instead made his coffee mug slip from his fingers, shattering on the floor. His garden, his pride and joy for over 30 years, lay in ruins. Deep tire tracks cut through his carefully tended flower beds like scars across the earth. The rose bushes he'd nurtured for decades were crushed, their broken stems scattered across the lawn. But what hurt most, what made his old soldier's heart nearly stop, was the empty spot where Mary's memorial garden had been. The special white rose bush, the one he planted on their 50th anniversary, was completely uprooted. The bronze plaque that read "Mary's Garden, where love blooms forever" was gone. Frank stood there, coffee spreading across his floor, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. His hands, which had remained steady even during the worst battles of the war, now trembled as he reached for the wall to steady himself. Mrs. Chen found him there 10 minutes later. She'd seen the destruction from her window and hurried over, still in her morning robe. "Oh, Mr. Frank," she whispered, tears in her eyes. She tried to guide him to a chair, but Frank wouldn't move. He kept staring at the empty spot where Mary's plaque had been, where he'd spent countless evenings talking to her memory. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mr. Rodriguez called in late to work and came over with his toolbox. Tommy and his dad arrived with garbage bags to help clean up. Even old Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down brought coffee and sandwiches for everyone. The community that had been cowering in fear now gathered around their veteran neighbor, united in their anger and sadness. As Frank finally walked through his destroyed garden, each step felt heavier than the last. The vegetables he grew to share with neighbors, trampled. The bird feeders his grandchildren had made him smashed. But it was the methodical destruction of Mary's memorial garden that told him this wasn't just vandalism, it was personal. "We should call the police," Mrs. Chen suggested, her hand on Frank's shoulder. But Frank knew better. Without witnesses, and with the bikers being careful to never quite break any serious laws, the police could do little more than file another report. He'd seen this pattern in the war. Bullies who knew exactly how far they could push while staying technically within the rules. By afternoon, the neighbors had helped clean up what they could. The tire tracks remained like ugly scars across his lawn, and the empty spot where Mary's garden had been felt like an open wound. Frank sat in his kitchen, surrounded by concerned neighbors, but feeling more alone than he had since Mary passed. Tommy, who'd been unusually quiet all day, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Frank, remember when you told us about the time in the war when your plane was outnumbered? You said sometimes you have to find a different way to fight." The boy's father tried to shush him, but Frank raised his hand. The kid was right. As the sun began to set and his neighbors reluctantly returned to their homes, Frank heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance. The sound that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for weeks now seemed different. Instead of feeling helpless, he felt something stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt since his days in uniform. Walking to his bedroom, Frank opened his closet door. On the top shelf, covered in dust, sat a wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were his medals, old photographs, and something else, something that might just change everything. His hands, steady now with purpose, reached for a small, worn business card tucked into the corner of the box. As the biker's laughter echoed from the empty lot, Frank stared at the card. The phone number was old, and he had no idea if it would still work. But as he looked out his window at the destroyed garden, at the empty spot where Mary's memorial had been, he knew he had to try. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Mary, about the neighborhood, about standing up to bullies who thought age meant weakness. Picking up his phone, Frank's fingers hovered over the numbers. In his mind, he could hear Mary's voice, gentle but firm. "Sometimes, honey, you have to fight for what's right." Taking a deep breath, he began to dial. Whatever happened next, things on Seba Street were about to change. That evening, as the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, Frank sat in his study holding the old wooden box from his closet. His hands moved slowly over its surface, fingertips tracing the familiar scratches and dents it had collected over the decades. Each mark told a story, just like the scars on his own hands. Opening the box released the familiar smell of old paper and wood polish. Inside lay the treasures of his military service, photographs yellowed with age, medals that still caught the light, and letters tied together with Mary's blue ribbon. But tonight, he wasn't looking for memories. He was searching for something specific. As he carefully lifted out the stack of photographs, memories flooded back. There he was, standing proud in his uniform beside his B-17 bomber. Another showed his maintenance crew, all of them so young, grinning despite the war raging around them. But it was the photo underneath that made him pause. The picture showed a tall, broad-shouldered man standing next to Frank, both of them covered in engine grease but smiling. On the back, in faded pencil, was written "Me and Iron Jack, Philippines, 1944. Iron Jack Morrison had been his commanding officer, a man who commanded respect not through fear, but through unwavering integrity and leadership. Frank remembered the day this photo was taken. They'd worked through the night to repair a damaged engine, knowing pilots' lives depended on their maintenance. Iron Jack had stayed right there with him, hands just as dirty, teaching him not just about engines, but about what it meant to be a true leader. Under the photos, he found what he was looking for, a business card, its edges worn soft from years in the box. The card was simple: James Iron Jack Morrison, Veterans Motorcycle Association President. On the back was a phone number, written in Iron Jack's distinct handwriting. Frank held the card close to his reading lamp, studying those numbers he'd never had to use before. After the war, Iron Jack had taken his leadership skills and love for motorcycles in a different direction. He'd founded a motorcycle club exclusively for veterans, turning his passion into a way to help former service members find community and purpose. Over the years, Frank had kept track of Iron Jack through occasional newspaper articles and stories from other veterans. The Veterans Motorcycle Association had grown into a respected organization known for their charity rides and support of military families. They were everything the hooligans in his yacht weren't. Riders who understood honor, respect, and the true meaning of brotherhood. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. Would the number even work after all these years? Would Iron Jack remember him? The last time they'd spoken was at a veterans reunion 15 years ago. Back then, Iron Jack had pressed this card into his hand, saying, "If you ever need anything, brother, anything at all, you call me." Frank glanced out his window at his ruined garden, barely visible in the growing darkness. The empty spot where Mary's memorial had stood seemed to glow like a wound in the twilight. He thought about his neighbors, Mrs. Chen hurrying her grandchildren inside, Tommy afraid to deliver newspapers, Mr. Rodriguez installing security cameras. This wasn't just about his garden anymore. Looking back at the photo of him and Iron Jack, Frank remembered something his old commander used to say: "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help." Back then, it had been about admitting when you couldn't fix an engine alone. Now, decades later, those words took on a new meaning. The clock on his wall showed 9:30 p.m., later than he usually made phone calls. But Iron Jack had always been a night owl, at least back in their service days. Frank remembered countless nights working on engines, Iron Jack's booming laugh keeping their spirits up as they fought fatigue. Taking a deep breath, Frank picked up his phone. His finger moved slowly over each number, every digit deliberately pressed as if defusing a bomb. Another skill from those distant war days. As the phone began to ring, Frank's mind raced with questions. Would anyone answer? Would the number even work? Had he waited too long? He was about to hang up when a deep voice answered. Older, rougher, but still unmistakable. "Morrison here." Frank's throat tightened with emotion. After all these years, his commander's voice still carried that same note of quiet authority. "Jack, it's Frank Thompson, from the 505th. Frank paused, then added softly, "Your engine man from the Philippines." The silence that followed felt like the longest moment of his life since the war. Then, through the phone, came a sound that made Frank's eyes water, that familiar, booming laugh he'd never forgotten. "Frank Thompson, my best damn mechanic. Brother, you still owe me for that bottle of whiskey in Manila." Iron Jack's voice was warm with recognition and genuine pleasure. As Frank began to tell his story, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the destruction of his garden, hope. Maybe, just maybe, the winds of change were about to blow through Cedar Street. As Frank sat in his favorite chair, phone pressed to his ear, the years seemed to melt away. Iron Jack listened quietly as Frank explained everything: the bikers, the harassment, the destroyed garden, and finally, Mary's missing memorial plaque. His old commander didn't interrupt once, but Frank could hear his breathing getting heavier with each detail. "And you say they're coming by every day?" Iron Jack's voice was calm, but Frank recognized that tone from their war days. It was the same voice his commander had used when discovering someone had been cutting corners on aircraft maintenance, calm on the surface, but with steel underneath. "Every afternoon like clockwork," Frank replied, his free hand absently touching the empty spot on his shelf where Mary's plaque used to sit. "The police say they can't do much since it's city property." He paused, suddenly feeling foolish for calling. "I know it's been years, Jack, and I hate to bother you with this." Iron Jack's laugh rumbled through the phone. "Bother me? Frank Thompson, you once stayed up 3 nights straight to fix my plane's engine before a crucial mission. You never asked for anything back then, and you haven't asked for anything in all these years since." There was a pause, then, "Tell me something. These guys, they wear patches on their jackets." Frank described the bikers' appearances, remembering details he hadn't even realized he'd noticed. His military training had never really left him. The habit of observing and remembering details was still sharp. As he spoke, he could hear Iron Jack making quiet sounds of recognition. "I know exactly who these boys are," Iron Jack said finally. "They've been causing trouble all over the county, thinking they're tough guys because nobody stands up to them." He chuckled, but it wasn't a happy sound. "They've never met real tough guys." Frank heard papers rustling on the other end of the line. "Now listen carefully, brother. This Saturday, I want you to stay inside. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" "What are you planning, Jack?" Frank asked, remembering how his commander's plans during the war had always worked out, even when they seemed impossible at first. Let's just say I'm going to teach these youngsters a lesson about respecting their elders. Iron Jack's voice softened. And Frank, that memorial plaque of Mary's, what exactly did it look like? As Frank described the bronze plaque in detail, he could hear Iron Jack writing something down. Don't you worry about a thing, his old commander said. You just stay inside Saturday and let me handle this. Oh, and one more thing, might want to tell your good neighbors to have their cameras ready. This is something they're going to want to remember. After hanging up, Frank sat in the growing darkness of his living room. The phone call had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it felt like he'd traveled back in time. Iron Jack's voice had brought back memories of another life, a life where problems had solutions, where right and wrong were clear, and where brotherhood meant something sacred. Looking out his window at the empty lot where the bikers would return tomorrow, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: peace. He didn't know exactly what Iron Jack was planning, but he remembered how his commander had always come through in the past. During the war, when things seemed darkest, Iron Jack would appear with a solution, a plan, and that confident smile that made everyone believe everything would be all right. That night, Frank slept better than he had in weeks. He dreamed of his younger days, of aircraft engines and military bases, of brotherhood and honor. But most importantly, he dreamed of Mary's garden, blooming once again in the summer sun. The next few days passed slowly. Frank watched as the bikers continued their daily harassment, but something had changed. Their taunts and revving engines no longer bothered him as much. He caught himself smiling sometimes, knowing what was coming. He wrote a note to his neighbors, passing it quietly from house to house. Stay inside this Saturday afternoon, but keep your cameras ready. Help is coming. The message spread through the neighborhood like a secret hope, passed from hand to hand, whispered over fences and through screen doors. By Friday night, the anticipation was almost unbearable. Frank sat on his porch, looking at his damaged garden in the twilight. Tomorrow, everything would change. He didn't know how, but he trusted Iron Jack just as much now as he had trusted him in the skies over the Pacific so many years ago. As he headed to bed that night, Frank paused by the window. The empty lot where the bikers gathered lay quiet and dark. Soon it would become a battlefield of sorts, not with weapons and violence, but with something more powerful: honor, respect, and the unbreakable bonds of true brotherhood. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Frank woke early, his old military habits serving him well on this important day. Through his kitchen window, he could see neighbors peeking out through their curtains, cameras ready, waiting for whatever was about to happen. The air felt charged with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Right on schedule around 2 o'clock, the familiar roar of motorcycles filled Cedar Street. The regular group rolled in, their usual swagger on full display as they set up in the empty lot. Snake, their leader, made a point of revving his engine extra loud as he passed Frank's house, probably wondering why the old veteran wasn't out in his garden as usual. By 3 o'clock, the group was in full swing, music blasting, beer cans already littering the ground. They were so caught up in their usual routine that they didn't notice the first distant rumble. But Frank heard it. It started as a low thunder, growing steadily louder, coming from all directions at once. Suddenly, the bikers' music was drowned out by the coordinated roar of dozens of motorcycles. From every street leading to the empty lot, riders appeared. These weren't just any bikers. These were veterans, their leather vests decorated with military patches and American flags. Their bikes gleamed in the afternoon sun, a mix of classic and modern machines, all perfectly maintained. At their head rode a massive figure that made Frank's eyes water with pride. Iron Jack Morrison sat astride a huge black motorcycle, his silver hair shining under his helmet. He looked older than Frank remembered, but his presence was just as commanding as it had been in the Philippines all those years ago. The veterans formed a perfect circle around the lot, their bikes creating a wall of chrome and steel. The troublemakers found themselves surrounded by over 50 riders, all sitting silently on their bikes, engines idling with a purposeful rumble. The contrast was striking. The veterans' disciplined formation against the chaotic scatter of the young bikers. Iron Jack dismounted his bike with the grace of someone who'd been riding for decades. He walked to the center of the lot, his boots crunching on the gravel. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that still carried the strength of his military days, he cut an imposing figure. "Afternoon, boys," Iron Jack's voice boomed across the lot. "I hear you've been having some fun at the expense of one of my old brothers in arms." He looked directly at Snake, who certainly seemed much smaller. "That stops today." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to pause their singing. Iron Jack continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of service. "The man whose garden you destroyed. He kept me and 12 other pilots alive during the war by making sure our planes were perfect every time we flew. The memorial you stole, that was for his wife, who spent 30 years helping military families in this community." From behind Iron Jack, 2 veterans wheeled their bikes forward. Strapped carefully to one was Mary's bronze plaque, polished to a shine. On the other bike was a white rose bush, its roots carefully wrapped. Frank felt his heart skip a beat. It looked exactly like the one that had been destroyed. "Now," Iron Jack said, his voice softening just slightly, "you boys have 2 choices. You can either help us replant this garden right now, or you can leave and never show your faces in this neighborhood again. Either way, this veteran, this hero, will be shown the respect he deserves." The transformation was almost comical. Snake, who had spent weeks terrorizing the neighborhood, now couldn't take off his bandana fast enough. "We'll help," he said quickly, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "We didn't know. We never meant." What happened next brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching from their windows. The veterans dismounted their bikes and, alongside the now humbled troublemakers, began restoring Frank's garden. Iron Jack personally supervised the replanting of the white rose bush and the remounting of Mary's plaque. As the afternoon wore on, more neighbors emerged from their houses. Mrs. Chen brought out cookies. Mr. Rodriguez arrived with his tools. Tommy and his father joined in with bags of fresh soil. What had started as a confrontation turned into a community celebration. Frank watched it all from his porch, where Iron Jack had insisted he sit like a proper commanding officer. His old commander sat beside him, both of them watching the transformation below. "You know," Iron Jack said quietly, "these young fellows just needed to learn what real brotherhood looks like." By sunset, Frank's garden was more beautiful than ever. The veterans had not only restored what was destroyed, but had added their own touches: small solar lights along the paths, new bird feeders, and a special section of red, white, and blue flowers arranged around Mary's memorial. Before they left, the veterans lined up their bikes along Seba Street and one by one saluted Frank on his porch. The troublemakers, who had spent the day working alongside real heroes, stood quietly to the side, their faces showing something new: respect. As the last bike rode away, Frank walked down to his restored garden. The white rose bush stood proud next to Mary's gleaming plaque. A new addition caught his eye: a small metal sign planted firmly by his front gate. It read, "This garden protected by the Veterans Motorcycle Association." That evening, as the neighborhood settled back into its peaceful routine, Frank sat in his garden talking softly to Mary's memorial. The birds had returned to their feeders, and the sweet scent of roses filled the air. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest victories aren't won through force, but through the power of brotherhood, respect, and the kind of strength that comes from a lifetime of doing what's right.